Welcome everyone. Good evening. It's so lovely to see you all here at the beautiful Petersham Bowling Club for another edition of Readers, Books and Conversation. If you haven't been before, welcome. My name is Michaela Kalowski and it is my absolute privilege to get to run these once a month with the Petersham Bolo. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we meet on tonight, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We are in for a mind and heart expanding treat this evening with James Bradley, who'll be talking about his extraordinary book, Deep Water, The World in the Ocean. Hearing about the insights, the learnings and the information about how we affect, think about and how we can change the natural world and our relationship with it. After reading his book, I think we can. In a moment, I'm going to tell you a bit about James and we'll get going. But tonight, I'll speak with James for 45 minutes and we have time at the end for your questions. And you can stay in your beautiful seats because a microphone will come to you and the house lights will come on so we can see you. So please keep them in mind as we're going along. We'd really love to hear from you at the end. I should also say on your way in, you will have noticed the beautiful table up the back from Berkeley Books in Leichhardt. At the end, you can purchase many copies of Deep Water. You can get in early for your holiday end-of-year book buying extravaganza, but we're very thrilled that they're a partner in this series as well. I wanted to tell you a bit more about James before we get going. James Bradley is a writer and a critic. He's the author of 7 novels, a book of poetry, a novella, and now a work of non-fiction. His novels include Rack, The Deep Field, The Resurrectionist, Glade and Ghost Species, and he was the editor of the Penguin Book of the Ocean. In 2012, he won the Pascal Prize for Australia's Critic of the Year, and he's been shortlisted twice for the Bragg Prize for Science Writing and nominated for a Walkley Award. His essays and articles have appeared in The Monthly, The Guardian, Cosmos magazine and The Washington Post, among others. His novels have won or been shortlisted for a number of major Australian literary awards, including the Age Fiction Book of the Year, the Miles Franklin Literary Award, the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards, and more. He is, I have to also just, while we're embarrassing him on stage, in 2021 he was, in the Queen's Birthday Honours, James was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for Services to Literature as a writer. So there, please join me in welcoming James Bradley. I know it's always a little painful to sit through, but we had to get it done, James. It's out of the way now. It's good. I wanted to start with a kind of a general question. In your writing life, in your novels, in your poetry, in your essays, and in your fantastic articles that are out and around now as well, there's a through line through pretty much all of them about writing about the natural world. And I wanted to ask you why, and also the impact that humans have on the natural world. And I wanted to ask you why that's so fascinating to you. Why has that been the thing you return to in your writing?
Well, it's something that's been in my writing for a really long time. So even in my early fiction, I was always deeply interested in kind of landscape and I guess that kind of sense of the cycles of things. But there was actually a kind of conscious thing behind it a bit as well, which is, I'm kind of been fascinated by animals. I studied philosophy at university and was fascinated by animals and animal minds and things like that. But about 15 years ago, maybe a bit longer, I got to this kind of point with my work and I thought, well, I don't like what I'm doing, and I think it's something that happens to a lot of writers. They get to about 40 and you've kind of written a couple of books and you're like, well, I've sort of exhausted that thing and I want to be doing something different and I don't like what I'm doing. I feel like I'm repeating myself. And I did what I was teaching a bit at the time, and I thought if someone came to me and said, I don't know what to write, I'd say, well, write about the thing you care about. And I thought, well, what do I care about? And I thought, well, at that point, the thing I really care about is kind of climate, environmental crisis, a series of questions around that. And I have to say at this point, they were not fashionable concerns. And so I started trying to, first of all, to work out how to write fiction in that space, but also trying to write non-fiction kind of in that space. And I'd had a really profound encounter when I was about, I don't know, probably 30 years ago now, with, I read Barry Lopez's Arctic Dreams, which is one of those books that had a kind of really massive effect on me. And I'd spent a long time trying to work out how I could do that. But I started trying to sell kind of articles about that kind of thing, reviews, to kind of work into that space, which was impossible, I have to say, 15 years ago, because there was no market for it. And that's really changed, I think, over the last 15 years. There's been a massive kind of efflorescence of writing about climate and the environment and animals, and a real shift in kind of public consciousness around that, which is fantastic. Also makes it easier to sell articles on the subject. But yes, I mean, so there is a kind of, I guess, a kind of affinity, and particularly around the ocean, with a number of those questions. But there's also a kind of conscious thing about, this is something I care about, and something's happening to it in the world, and I want to do something about it. Does that make sense?
It does. It's fascinating to hear that you were interested in the sort of you were studying philosophy, you were interested in kind of the inner lives of animals generally, which makes sense when we read your wonderful writing. But you don't have a science background, you have a law background as well. And I wanted to ask you, when we read something like Deep Water, is that distance you have, that you're not an academic, you don't come from that field, is that something you bring to how you write about the work?
I was the world's crummiest lawyer for about 2 years. Yeah. I'm one of those many failed lawyers.
He beat me by about 1.5 years.
Yeah. I worked for a judge in South Australia for a year who was a nudist, and he had his chambers was filled. He was an awful man, but his chambers were filled with pictures of him and his friends, kind of lounging on the beach.
Oh wow!
And he was an environmentalist and wouldn't let us have heating or cooling in the chambers because he thought it was wasteful. And in the summer, he had a red leather chaise lounge, and he would strip off and lie around in his red Speedos, writing his judgments while we all sweltered in suits. Yeah. But
I'm feeling like the end of James's career as a lawyer was not really his fault, I think, is what I'm hearing.
I've actually now forgotten the question. Sorry. Now that I've told you about the terrible judge I used to work for.
It's just seared into my mind now. That we're saying that you're not a scientist turned writer.
Yeah. Sorry. He then left Adelaide, moved to Tuvalu to become the High Justice. No, not Tuvalu, Kiribati.
Oh, wow.
No, he died. Yeah, I mean, look, I think... I'm sorry about that. I do think that I guess, I don't have a science background, and I really feel that around a series of things. Certainly writing this book, I had to read a lot of papers, and that art of reading scientific papers is a real skill, and I don't know that I've learned it, but I've got better at it, but I wish I had that skill, and I have no statistics, which makes a lot of science quite difficult when you're looking, that's when you find yourself reading The Guardian or Nature telling you what it's actually about. But I think that there is something about, like, what you're actually looking for are the kind of connections and the stories rather than the science. I mean, I noticed when the book came out in the States recently, it was classed as a science book. I kept thinking it's not a science book.
No.
It's quite deliberately not a science book. It's a book that's about making connections between a whole lot of disciplines and ideas. So what I was always interested in was the thing... what is this information revealing? What is it showing us? And sometimes that's science, and I find science totally fascinating, but often it's other things as well. And my test for it was always, do I think this is interesting? So there's an awful lot of things in the book that I just thought were kind of cool things that I thought were interesting, but that seemed to be a good place to start, because you're looking for that thing that will engage people, I guess, kind of emotionally and intellectually simultaneously. So yeah, I mean, there is a kind of, I guess I approach these things as someone looking for kind of narrative and feeling, but trying to find it in science and history and things like that, and to kind of see how those things connect, because the book's very much about making connections.
Yes. And it's enormously powerful on all those fronts. And I want to dive in. The first half of the conversation I want to have with James is sort of about the life on top of the ocean and in the ocean. So marine life, the sound of the ocean, what we know and don't know about the deep ocean. And James's book is enormously layered and complex. So we'll get through as much as we can. And in the second half of our conversation, I want to talk about humans and the ocean and the impact we've had on it, and the way that we've exploited it or misunderstood it or feared it, or just not really worked out how to be with it, and also the cultures who are different from that as well. In the first chapter of the book, you write about the way that our life on the planet began in the oceans, and that the ocean's waters remain essential to sustain it. Can you talk a little bit about that proposition?
Yeah, well, so the ocean... I mean, the ocean is absolutely central to kind of life on Earth. It's a big part of the carbon cycle. You know, the currents help maintain... The currents in the ocean help maintain the kind of temperature of the planet. The water in the ocean kind of cycles through everything. It cycles through our bodies. It cycles through all the plants. I mean, it cycles through everything. So there's a kind of level at which everything on the planet is connected to the oceans in a really profound kind of way. But life did begin in the ocean. You know, maybe it began in a pool. These days there seems to be a view that perhaps it began by some kind of vent, you know, so rather than kind of Darwin's shallow pool, it began down somewhere where there was contact between, I guess, kind of magma and water, which you get at the moment in the vents on the sea floor, which have these kind of chemogenic kind of assemblages of life around them. But there is something incredibly profound in that idea, because, I mean, what we do know is that all life began there in the water. Everything on Earth evolved from that, you know. And at one level, that's a kind of glib idea, but it's actually also not. I mean, this sense that everything that lives on our planet is connected back down to the ocean means also that we're all connected to each other by that connection to the ocean. There's this kind of sense that every living thing is something we're related to, and that is through the ocean. And there is something, I think, kind of profound about that kind of sense of connection across the extraordinary difference of beings and creatures and things on our planet that are alive.
And I loved at the beginning of the book when James says, he explains that we're not really a terrestrial planet, where we live on a deep ocean planet, we just live on the very top bit, which I thought was a really great way of kind of rethinking the Earth as well. When you talked before about the origin of the ocean as well, you've said to me before tonight's conversation that there's a little bit of argy-bargy still between academics about where the oceans were, how they were formed here. Can you give us a little bit of that history? Because I also found, James said before, there are lots of cool things in the book. There are so many cool things in the book. This is one of them. So if you'd asked someone, I think 20 years ago, they would have said that when the Earth formed, it was too hot. So back in the Hadean, when it first formed about 4.5 billion years ago, it was too hot, and there wouldn't have been any water. So the water arrived later, was the argument, and kind of came to Earth on meteors and comets. And that story started to unravel, partly because it turns out that a number of the comets, all water has an isotopic signature, so you can tell where it came from, and the water on Earth has a different isotopic signature to the water on Mars, for instance, and a different isotopic signature to the water on Pluto. But it now seems to be the case that most of the water on Earth was actually here right from the start. So it kind of arrived in the rocks and dust that the planet formed on, and was here right through that hot stage. It survived the collision with Theia, the planet that collided with the Earth and made the Moon, and then formed oceans relatively quickly after the planet formed. Some then arrived on comets and on meteors, but you could kind of see that. It's one that I just think it's fascinating. It's something that you feel like we should know for sure, and it's clearly still in flux, which I find really interesting. I mean, one of the other they've discovered that there's vast amounts of water down in the crust. So there is a volume of, I'm calling it water, it's not quite, it's water in a slightly different chemical form, but down about 500 kilometres below the surface, there is a band of what they call of water-bearing rock, which has about 3 times the amount of water that's actually in the oceans, in the crust, kind of down there in this kind of contained in this rock. And there's a kind of water cycle within the planet where the water moves in and out of the oceans and in and out of the crust. So there's this kind of sense that the planet is actually kind of cycling water through itself in a really fascinating kind of way. Extraordinary. I want to go to the deep ocean now. You write really beautifully about the deep ocean, about the things that we've learned in the last 30 or 40 decades, but also about so many of the things that are still a complete mystery to us, even given the extraordinary technology we have to go really deep into these trenches. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of some of the creatures that live in the deep ocean, who, as you write about in the book, never surface?
Yeah, so there's a lot of ocean. So the ocean is about 71% of the planet's surface, And it's very deep. So on average, the ocean is about 4 kilometres deep. So that's a lot of water. About 2/3 of the ocean, and that's about half the planet's surface, is what they call abyssal plain. So it's essentially flat, fairly unvaried bottom, which is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kilometres down. And then you have trenches, and trenches are places where you've got continental plates butting up against each other, and they form what's called a subduction zone. So what happens is when they collide with each other, one of the plates dives under the other one, so you get these huge places where it kind of drops away. And you get quite different life in the two places. So the abyssal plain has, we don't actually know a huge amount about it, I don't think. But there's all kinds of things down there, but life moves very slowly, there's not much nutrition. And that's where all the nodules that they want to mine are down there in areas of the abyssal plain. But down in the trenches, you have a whole lot of other kind of life. But you also then have this huge space of water above it. And so once you get down, 2-3 kilometres, there's all kinds of fish, there's all kinds of things living down there. But they live in this completely unbounded world. Like if you're a fish that lives down in the Mesopelagic, a couple of kilometres under the surface of the water, you won't ever encounter the surface, you won't ever encounter the bottom, you'll never encounter land. Like you live in this entirely liquid world, which I find kind of extraordinary. And once you're down in that deep water also, what you're surviving, the whole thing lives off, because there's no photosynthesis, they live off the food that kind of rains down from the top. So you've got to kind of catch it. You get this thing called marine snow, which is essentially the crap from the top sliding down.
Marine snow sounds much nicer.
It does sound much nicer
from the top.
Well, and in fact, one of the scientists I interviewed for the book is a man called Alan Jameson. He's been down in a submersible to the bottom of all the trenches, so the bottom of Mariana Trench a couple of times, and but he was talking at one point about surfacing in the submersible that he uses, and as they were coming up, he said that you get the marine snow kind of going over the front of it because lots of it's bioluminescent. It actually looks like this kind of snowfall of bioluminescence going past the port as you go up through the water.
There's another description I wanted you to share with people about a kind of plant life, marine plant life that looks like a field of flowers. Can you explain that?
The first time I spoke to Alan, he just got back from diving in I forget which trench it was. It's in the book. But he said that he'd been down, I think, at about 8 kilometres, and he'd come across a field of crinoids, which are an animal that looks a bit like a flower, and there was a kind of field of them kind of growing off into the distance, and they were bright yellow, he said. And of course, no one's ever seen that colour because there's no light down there till you take a light down there to see it. But also, I said to him, so how big do you think the field was? And he said, it probably went on for 100 kilometres. This kind of notion of these huge things. And the other thing he said I thought was really fascinating was that he talked about the trenches, and he said that they're actually a very violent kind of place in lots of ways because you've got landslides coming down, you've got quite a lot of kind of seismic and volcanic activity often in them. And he said, so you have these actually quite dynamic and quite violent environments, but with incredibly delicate life often living in them, which he was saying is kind of fascinating.
Mm. You've written a really beautiful article recently for The Guardian about Newstons, I think we describe them, also known as bluebottles, and the photos are extraordinary. I never knew bluebottles could be so beautiful. But it's described in the article that these are creatures that actually descended from, they're a species that were from the sea floor that have ended up on the surface of the ocean. They're like an inverted seafloor creature. And you write about the fact that they, despite the ubiquity of them, you say, they remain poorly understood and critically understudied. And I wanted to ask you to sort of take us to this, because it comes up a lot in the book, about why do we know so little about these creatures, especially ones that we, in this case, that are visible to us, that are ubiquitous.
Yeah. So with the deep ocean, one of the reasons we don't know much about it is it's really hard to go there.
Yeah.
It's only been, in fact, in the last few years that they've had technologies. We've had submersibles that would go down, but not, only a few kilometres. And then about 15 or 20 years ago, they invented what they call Hadal landers, which are basically probes they can drop and they'll sink right to the bottom and take some videos and do some things, and they'll come back up, and then they've built some more submersibles that will go down. But you see that in the argument around deep sea mining where, we just don't know enough about that environment to make a kind of assessment of whether we can do it safely. And in fact, there was a study recently which said that our knowledge of that kind of deep sea environment where it lives is so bad that we can't even make an informed cost-benefit kind of analysis of it. Like, we just don't know enough. Every time we pull things up, 70% of the species are new when they come off. So we just don't understand it. But with the Newston is... It's a kind of ecology of floating things. So there's a series of animals that live on the ocean surface. So bluebottles are one. There are some other... They're hydrozoans, which are a kind of colony animal. There are some others, like Vallela is another hydrozoan. But then there are really weird things. So there's like a sea anemone, which has retooled the thing that it clings to the bottom with, it's retooled into a float, and it floats upside down from the water. There's a couple of species of snail, one of them feeds on bluebottles actually, and they create like bubble rafts that they float on, and there are there's all kinds of things, and the Newston kind of drifts with the wind and the currents, and I mean that means a couple of things. First of all, it's kind of this transient thing, so it's quite difficult to study because you've got to go out and find it. So they've been trying to use citizen science to learn more about it. But again, we don't even have a baseline to really understand what's happening with it. But the other thing with the Newston is that, of course, the other thing that floats in the ocean is plastic. So you end up out in the big gyres where the plastic gathers out, and the garbage patches are also Newston environments. So you've got this, and which is terrible at one level, but in fact for some of the Newston it's quite good. So for some of the snails and things, the plastic is good. They can actually use it as a substrate to kind of live on. But for most of them, we don't know what it means. And the problem is for lots of animals, they feed on the Newston. So some turtles get about 70% of their food from the Newston, and if it's all mixed up with plastic, They're ingesting all the plastic. Yeah. So there's a series of kind of real problems around all of that. But yeah, we actually don't know very much about it, and almost nobody studies it. And it's literally about the logistical difficulties of studying it.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about fish. You write in the book that they're sort of much maligned, that people think of them, quote unquote, as slimy automatons. And that, I think about all those amazing National Geographic photographs of mountain lions and polar bears, and you feel like you can see inside their mind. And I don't feel like fish get the same treatment, really. But you write about how extraordinary they are. You write about their intelligence. You write about their sociability. Can you tell us a bit about what you learned about fish and what we can learn about fish?
I think people don't think about fish. I think they are very... We find, again, I think it's partly a thing about we don't see them. They live down under the sea. We don't interact with them, but they're actually, the more we've learned about fish, the more we've learned that they are, in many cases intelligent, they're highly social, they have culture. Fish pass information from generation to generation. They teach each other things, they communicate in a whole range of quite complex ways, both with sound but also with scent. There are groups of electric eels which talk with electric pulses. They communicate with electric pulses.
Almost like a Morse code.
Yeah, they have literally, and they've managed their hierarchies with it. So there's all kinds of fish that do all kinds of things. But what's also become clear is that there's a whole series of cognitive tests they do with fish. On a number of them, they perform better than dogs. They perform as well as chimpanzees. Some fish,
wow.
And that's one thing. The other end of that is that we fail with a kind of moral test with fish, and I'm doing it here, where what I do is I say the fish is intelligent, therefore you should care about it. But fish feel pain, they suffer, and the way we catch them and treat them causes them terrible pain, So in a sense, that's maybe the thing we should worry about. But there's also, I talk in the book about cleaner wrasse, and there's been a series of really fascinating studies around cleaner wrasse, which you'll have seen them on nature documentaries. They're about the size of your finger, and they're the ones that maintain the cleaning stations where the fish come to be cleaned. And the cleaner wrasse, So a cleaner wrasse will have a kind of clientele, which will be maybe 100 fish. It will be able to recognise all of them. But the cleaner wrasse, when they clean, they eat dead skin and they eat parasites. But they also don't mind having a little bit of like fresh mucus off the side of the fish. And if they take the fresh mucus, it hurts the fish, right? And so the wrasse are very, very sneaky. So the wrasse they'll never bite a new customer. They'll only bite customers they've had for a while. They'll never bite customers if somebody is watching, right? They will, if they upset a fish and it swims away, they'll go after it and try and calm it down. But this is all kind of really significant because it means that this wrasse is attributing, it's got a theory of mind, it means it's attributing thoughts to these other fish and reacting to it. And a group of scientists have shown that the wrasse also pass what they call the mirror test, which is, for 50 years been the gold standard of self-recognition is a sign of consciousness, which almost nothing passes. Like we pass it, some of the great apes pass it, dolphins pass it, some parrots seem to, almost nothing passes it. And there is a kind of argument about what that really means. And there's a lot of, certainly one of the scientists I was talking to who's on the People on the Thing says it doesn't show necessarily that the wrasse are self-aware. He thinks it shows that the test doesn't mean what we think it means. But since the wrasse have now passed another stage of the test, I suspect it probably means that the wrasse are recognising themselves. But the other wonderful thing about, I'm going to stop talking about wrasse in a second, the other wonderful thing about wrasse is they will go to another wrasse's cleaning station, and if the other wrasse isn't there, they'll bite all of their customers and then go back. They're fantastic. I
love it.
But, there's a whole bunch of fish that have kind of extraordinarily complex behaviours like that, and we don't think about them because they're down under the water.
Yeah. And also there's wonderful stuff in your book where you talk about the categories with which we've been told to judge and classify animals, and also how we've known this for a long time now as humans, that we study things using our intelligence and our environment as a framework. And if we don't understand what the environment is like for fish who are permanently in a wet environment, then our framework isn't going to work.
Yeah. Well, and just that sense that with any animal you are dealing with a creature that's sensory world, and your inner world is shaped by how you perceive the world around you, how you connect with it, that kind of sense of a kind of Umwelt, which is shaped by the different perceptions. And with fish, as with all animals, it's often very different. I mean, lots of them, they smell, they're incredibly reliant on smell. All fish have a so when you see fish swimming and they do that thing where they all turn at once, that's because they've got a line. That line they have up their side has tiny little hairs in it which allow them to feel movements in the water around them. So they've literally got a kind of extended sense of self in the water where they can feel things happening around them. I mean, I'm not sure that I can imagine what that would be like. Yeah. But it's clearly very different to how I am in the world, and that's true of all of these kinds of animals. But I also think that there is something I actually say in the book. I think there's a kind of argument about how far we can imagine ourselves into those completely different ways of being, but I do think something happens if we try and do that, where there's a kind of an expansion of our sense of possibility, but also a kind of, it alters our sense that we're the only way of being in the world. It allows us to see that there are other ways of being and that maybe we should think about them, value them. So, I do think there is something about that, the act of trying to imagine that is very important.
There's an incredible chapter in the book called Echo, which is about the sound of the ocean and the way in which it's one of the first places where we really start to see the way in which humans have messed with that, messed with it. It's all the way through the book. But you talk about, we know about whale song and dolphin song, but you write about whale language, which I thought was really fascinating. But I can't have this conversation with you tonight without talking about the idea that humpback whales are like jazz singers. And I want you to explain a little bit about the different way that different whales sing different kinds of songs, including long songs. I thought that was extraordinary.
Yeah. So there's essentially two groups of whales. There's beaked whales, which are dolphins and orcas and pilot whales and all of those ones, and they have sonar. And then there's the baleen whales, which are humpbacks and right whales and blue whales and all of those ones. I saw a blue whale once. It was amazing. And it dove near the boat we were in, and it was literally like it was so long. It was like someone was turning a wheel because it was quite narrow, and you just kept going. It's going to end soon, and it just kept on going. It was extraordinary. But I think all of the baleen whales sing. I think one species doesn't, or one species we haven't established does, and they all sing different kinds of songs. But the humpbacks are the kind of they sing the longest songs and the most. Well, there's some argument about whether they're the most complex, but they sing the longest songs, and it is this kind of extraordinary behaviour where there's kind of pattern within the songs. They repeat them, they vary them. So what they'll do is they'll kind of sing bits of them differently, but they keep the pattern the same. So it's literally like a singer singing lyrics differently. But they also, if the song's very long, so what the song will have is it'll have a series of kind of sounds, and they're arranged into units, and then there's several units will make up a song. And if it's a complex song, they tend to end and begin the different bits with the same sound, in the same way that we use rhyme. And so the songs are kind of this incredibly complex behaviour, and we've only known about it since, the 1960s, 1970s. I also was, there's a story about the discovery of whale song, which is about Roger Payne and Scott McVeigh, and Payne and his wife Katie Payne got given recordings by a guy in Bermuda who'd been recording them, and they took them away, and Katie worked out that there was pattern within them, and then Hella McVeigh, who was Scott McVeigh's wife, did more work on it. Then Scott McVeigh and Roger Payne published the Songs of the Humpback Whale paper. But when I was finishing the book, I had to get the rights to one of the images I used in it, which is one of Roger Payne's pictures. And I couldn't, Roger Payne had died about 6 months before. He's an extraordinary man. And I thought, well, I tracked down his son online, and I emailed the son and said, oh, look, I'm trying to get rights to this picture. Would that be all right? And when he replied CCing the whole family, including Katie, who was still alive. Yeah. And Katie had done all of this amazing work around she was the person who found out that elephants communicate using infrasound, so kind of below that they kind of rumble and talk to each other down there where we can't hear it. And so I ended up having this kind of email correspondence with Katie Payne, which was like one of the highlights of my life, I have to say.
It's an incredibly beautiful chapter about sort of acoustic ecology and the people who study it. And again, thinking about if we can't hear it, we can't think about it. And the whole concept of keeping things quiet, as a human way of talking about silences and secrets. It's a wonderful part of the book. We have to talk about humans now. Now it gets really depressing. Sorry. You write really beautifully about the way that humans, a lot of humans were near bodies of water, that they had a period of time where they were very into swimming, and then they had about 8,000 years where they were absolutely not into swimming. And I wanted you just to give us a sense of how being near water has made us human.
Yeah, so humans evolved in Africa. We kind of moved out in a series of waves, different species, kind of across the planet. That process of doing that involved kind of managing water. There's this kind of notion that we are kind of creatures of the edge. We kind of evolve, in places and live in places where you get those kind of transitions between different environments. But that kind of movement out kind of changed us in really profound ways. It's kind of what distributed us around the planet, but it's also what allowed us to, you see the kind of beginnings of all kind of complex behaviours beginning about that. You see the kind of movement into different parts of the world, but you also see, us kind of, there's a kind of cultural thing there as well. And if you look, the first art that we know of is scratchings on a shell. The first decoration we know of is shell beads. And that's partly because they're a kind of material culture that lasts in a way that grass or other things don't. But shells have clearly been a really deep part of our kind of culture for a really long time. You go and you look at the kind of remains that get left behind, there's kind of middens, that kind of sense that the ocean has been part of us for such a long time.
And you detail as a wonderful chapter about swimming and where the whole notion of Australian crawl began. It's fascinating. But there's also, it's really you're writing about the racialisation of swimming as well, about cultures, the English for a period of time deemed that anyone who swam was a fool. And I'm assuming that's because they were so kind of completely freaked out by bodies and the idea of kind of being naked or immerging yourself in a body of water. But I wondered if you could give us a couple of examples on either side of cultures who were very, very fearful of water and cultures who weren't.
Yeah. So there's a kind of shift that takes place. There's a couple of shifts. So people in Eurasia kind of stopped swimming about 8,000 years ago. So we know that people were swimming before that. We know that Neanderthals swam, for instance. We know that Neanderthals swam because when we look at their skulls, lots of them have swimmer's ear, the bony growths that we get. We also know that there are all of these shells that you get in Neanderthal sites which have been taken from the bottom of the ocean, so they must have swum down to get them. We know that the Neanderthals who ended up in Gibraltar were killing seals and dolphins, so they must have been able to swim. But you have a kind of people stop swimming there, but you have something that happens. Swimming is one of those things where it's in the ancient world and kind of ancient Europe particularly. It had a whole series of connotations, but at the end of the Roman Empire, essentially a lot of people in Europe stopped swimming. And you have a kind of real retreat from the water that happens. And exactly why that happens, to be honest, I don't know. I spent some time when I was writing the book trying to work it out, and the answer seems to be that people don't know. It seems to have been a combination of things. It seems to have been partly a religious thing. It seems to have been about bodies, as you said. It seems to have perhaps been about the dirtiness of the water. Water becomes something, it's no longer something that you clean with. It's something that it's a kind of site of disease, and
it's where you throw things away.
Where you throw things away. So Europeans kind of stop swimming, and you see that when they start moving out from Europe into Africa, particularly because the Africans, particularly along the west coast of Africa, were extraordinary swimmers. You had a kind of world in all of those places where you've got a huge mingling of kind of rivers and ocean and stuff. You also don't have any real harbours a lot of the time, so being able to swim through surf out to ships was really important for all of the kind of kingdoms and places that were there. But the Europeans were completely amazed by the swimming abilities of Africans. They were completely amazed by the swimming abilities of Native Americans. They were completely amazed by the swimming abilities of people in Asia. But it got digested quite quickly into a kind of set of kind of racial categories. So it becomes one of the ways that you separate Europeans from these people who could swim, and then there's this kind of notion that Africans are born able to swim, like an animal. The stuff is absolutely horrible when you read it. It's grotesque. But even into the kind of 19th century, so by the 19th century in England, swimming's become a real kind of sensation. There's public baths everywhere. The thought of a Victorian public bath is a truly horrifying notion, but people used to go to them all the time. But no one swam overarm. So there was a whole thing about Europeans swam civilised strokes, and that means breaststroke. Overarm strokes were native swimming or black swimming. And you didn't do them, and so the trudgeon stroke, which is this weird one-armed side stroke, comes along late in the 19th century, and then in the early 20th century you get the arrival of the Australian crawl. But the Australian crawl is not actually the Australian crawl. It was the guys who invented it actually learned it from watching a man called Alec Wickham, who was from the Solomon Islands. So it's actually the Roviana Lagoon crawl, if it's anything. But it was that kind of, you have this kind of story about this kind of appropriation of this stroke. But you have this completely racialised idea of kind of swimming, which continued for a really, really long time.
I want to ask you about the Mirning people of the Yinila Nation, who you spent time with. Their country lies along the edge of the Great Australian Bight, and you spent time with Uncle Bunalori and Iris Burgoyne. And can you give us a little sense about what their people remember their ancient connection to coast and sea.
Yeah, I didn't actually meet Iris.
Okay.
I read some of Iris's documents. No, Bunna is a Mabinbai who's a whaleman, and so the Merning have their kind of creation myth is about a being called Jedera who was a whale and kind of created the kind of landscape along there, and they are one of a number of Indigenous Australian cultures which have stories about what happened when the water came up. When the sea level rise started, coming up 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago. And in their case, so lots of those stories will be various kinds of dreaming stories. There's a whole range of them. But with the Merning, they've got stories about what's down there under the water. They've got stories about the creeks and the places, and they've got dreaming sites down there. And there's one in particular which is a place where Jedera bled and he created ochre. And in the story, it's quite a practical story. It's like we used to go there and get it, and then the water got deeper and we could swim down, and then we couldn't, and now we pick it up on the beach. But this kind of notion that these cultures have actually been passing, the kind of an oral culture can pass information over kind of 8, 10, 12,000 years is just kind of extraordinary. But it's also about this kind of, I think in Australia people talk a lot about Indigenous cultures being the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, but we don't. As one of the people I spoke to when I was writing about this said, people don't think about what that means, and it does actually mean cultures which have been engaged in this kind of conversation with their country and caring for their country for huge spans of time. 8,000 years longer than the oldest written text. And can preserve and carry information across that time, and that says something to us about I think about the kind of time frames that you're talking about, and the kinds of ways of the kind of sophistication of a culture that can do that. I actually found that part of the book really quite remarkable to write, I felt very. Yeah, I was very grateful to Bunna particularly, but several other people for talking to me so much. It was great.
There are startling sociological and sort of political insights. They're the ones that, as soon as you read them, they seem simple, but they maybe hadn't occurred to you in the way that James has sort of laid them all together. And the one that you detail, and which really stopped me in my tracks, is that every empire that became an empire had access to a port because they used the seas to exploit other places, other people. And I wanted you to talk about, I suppose it's a very big strand that runs through every chapter of the book, really, which is about the connection between oceans, empire, and the colonialist kind of mindset and the birth of capitalism. They're very big, intertwined, hand in glove strands in this book. Can you talk a little bit about how you wanted to weave those ideas into a book that is nominally about the oceans as well? Because you do it without ever being didactic, but it's very much a part of this book.
I do worry it is a little didactic.
Well, I got the point.
I hope you got it a few times.
I did.
Yeah, look, I think, well, one of the things that you see is that, colonialism is a kind of oceanic phenomenon. Like, it takes place because you can kind of project over oceans. You can move things around. It has its beginnings in the expansion of Europe in the kind of 14th century, 15th century, and kind of accelerates outwards from there, from kind of Africa and over to the Americas and then around. That is kind of European wealth is built on that process. But what you also see is that capitalism particularly is a kind of oceanic phenomenon, and that is both in the sense that many of the kind of legal structures that that capitalism arises out of, or that kind of sustain capitalism begin on the ocean. You see the company comes into being, the corporation comes into being, partly to sustain kind of colonial ventures. You see lots of the kind of insurance structures that kind of underlie that and allow you to defray risk in various ways kind of evolve there. You see the kind of movement of goods in the 20th century, which is incredibly important, and the kind of evolution of shipping and things like that. But you also see there's a kind of profound shift in our relationship with, I guess, with the natural world, and that begins to take place as you start seeing this projection outwards from Europe. And one of the things I talk about in the book is what happened on Madeira. And so
that's a brilliant section of the book.
Yeah, thank you. But so Madeira is a group of islands that are a bit out near the Canaries. They're out in the Atlantic Ocean, and the Portuguese got there in about 1400, and they were uninhabited. They were completely covered with trees. And so they set up a colony out there. And the colony kind of ticked over for 20 or 30 years and didn't really become very wealthy. But then they got given a license to make sugar. And sugar is one of the great kind of invisible engines of kind of world history. And so they have this technology to make sugar, this mill, but to make sugar is an incredibly destructive crop. And this technology for making it involves huge amounts of energy. I think the figure is you need 200 kilos of timber for a kilo of sugar. Yes. It might be 20. I think it's 200.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. I'll have to remember my number. But it's a lot. You need lots of water. And you need lots of labour, because you've got to be able to harvest the sugar at just the right moment, move it in, boil it up, get it moved over. And so what happens is after they start making sugar there is you see the economy there kind of boom. The whole thing is financed with Genoese money. So you've got money coming from elsewhere to create this kind of frontier out in the middle of the ocean. They start cutting the trees down to run the sugar mills. And they start bringing labour in. And they start bringing in slave labour, most of which at this point are the Guanches, who are the indigenous people of the Canary Islands. And you see this just extraordinary boom in kind of sugar production. And it goes up and up and up and up. And this goes on for about 50 to 70 years. And by the end of it, the timber's all gone.
Yes.
The Guanches have been wiped out.
Yes.
And then the whole thing collapses. And you see the kind of first of these kind of huge boom bust kind of things happening. What you also see is the evolution of a plantation system. And I wish it was my line, but it's an economic historian I quote in the book who says, the plantation is the original factory. That's where you do it. And you kind of see, but what you see there is that, the kind of these things, ecological destruction, indigenous dispossession, slavery, they're not like unfortunate side effects of the system. They were part of the system from day one. They're the thing that kind of drives the system. And they are kind of founded in a kind of shift in the way we think about things. We have to take people and turn them into things. We place nature there and make it a resource rather than something that we live with and care for. So you see this really profound transformation taking place, kind of with the sugar happening on this island being shipped around. And what you have after Madeira is the sugar front kind of moves on to Sao Tome. By the time it gets to Sao Tome, you've got fully racialised slavery coming in from Africa. Then it's over to Brazil, and then
you're off and running.
And then it's all on.
And the chapter on slavery, it's a very important part of the book, is really chilling to read. 12.5 million people trafficked and transported across the oceans during the years between 1501 and 1867, and millions more killed in raids and conflicts and skirmishes when they were being stolen, let alone the people who died and were thrown overboard. In that chapter on echoes, James writes beautifully about the slave songs that were sung on the ship, some of which the songs themselves were not recorded, but it's part of the sounds of the ocean. The history of the ocean is the people who were moved on that ocean as well. It's an extraordinary part of the book. I'm conscious I want to leave time for questions from our audience, but I wanted to ask you something we spoke about before tonight, which was a conversation with on a radio program that I mentioned to you, where they mentioned the work of an amazing American evolutionary biologist called Lynn Margulis, and she talked about the idea that everything is equally evolved, that everything on Earth evolved at the same time as everything else. So the idea of how we classify things is kind of wrong. And I just wanted to get your sense of that as we sort of bring these ideas back around.
Well, I wouldn't want to disagree with Lynn Margulis.
It reminded me of your book and the ideas you illuminate as well.
I think that, in fact, Lynn Margulis is the one who came up with the name Gaia when Lovelock came up with the theory. I could be wrong about that, but I think so.
Yeah.
I should know. I think it's a really fascinating notion because we remain very trapped in a kind of great chain of being, I think, in our culture, where we think of ourselves as the kind of pinnacle of evolution, or something that's above everything else. But we're not. We're part of a kind of web of life. And that, thinking of ourselves as above things means that our systems of valuing are all ones about what's it worth, rather than, it has a kind of intrinsic value to itself. I mean, it's a fundamental part of the process, I think, of capitalism and colonialism, is that kind of dehumanization and the de-animation of things around you. I mean, you look at other cultures and, the world is kind of alive, and not just animals, but plants, places, rocks. They all have kind of life and meaning, and we drain all of that meaning out of it, I think, by placing ourselves above it. So there is something quite important, I think, about that idea that things, it's not like there's a chain of being that we're at the top of. It's just that things have changed over time, but we've all been changing over time. So I mean, I actually think it's a really profound kind of statement, and I do need to go up and look at whether she came up with the name Gaia.
But it's also, as you said to me before tonight, a kind of a falsification of the data to look at nature and imagine, as it has been economically in historical terms, that it's limitless and that it's free, that it's unending, and that it's just, as you say, turned into a resource, something we take and take and take from. And you detail very clearly how Indigenous cultures knew that you didn't take more than you needed, and that capitalism is the exact opposite of that proposition. Yeah. So it's interesting. It's about that the values we put on things allow us to get away with the decisions we make, as if, and you write about extinction. There's a wonderful article that James has written recently in The Guardian about what it's like to go and visit, creatures in the Australian Museum that are extinct. And even the language. Can you talk a little bit about the language we use around, fish and extinction? We talk about it, as you said to me before, as if it's a fait accompli. It's so sad it happened. It's like, we made it happen. Yeah, Can you talk a bit about that?
So I did a piece recently which was about the Australian Museum has what they call extinction cabinets, and they're a group of cupboards. I went to the ones in the mammal collection. There are some in the birds, and I think there are some in the reptiles as well. But essentially, it's the place that they put all of the specimens they've got of extinct animals. And lots of these animals, we have almost nothing of them, and they're gone. And they're a really... I can make jokes about almost anything. I found them a really intense and really very moving experience. I mean, the guy who was showing them to me says that people cry all the time. You open them up and people have just burst into tears, and I didn't do that. But I did find you have all this emotion and you don't know what to do with it. Like, what do I do with this emotion? Like, well, how should I be feeling? Like I said in the article, should I be sad? Should I be, angry? Should I be, what should I do with this emotion? And I think there is something about the way we talk about these things. I mean, we talk about animals going extinct, but they didn't go extinct. We wiped them out. But we do it with all the conditionals around climate and the environment as well. So, we talk about, temperatures might, if temperatures increase, like temperatures are increasing, they're going to continue to increase. If sea levels rise, there is a large amount of sea level rise locked in whatever happens. At this point, we have no way of stopping it. I heard a glaciologist say the only uncertainty with sea level rise is upwards. But there is a way that language, there's a kind of passive tone that we use, and then there's a series of kind of words that we use and conditionals rather than rather than talking about it will, that I think mostly hide it from us. I think sometimes they help in another direction, which one of the things that we need to get away from is the idea that we can't do anything about these problems. It's interesting, when I was looking at the extinction stuff, one of the scientists I was talking to, he said the thing that makes me really upset is that we know what we do, we know what works. Countries like New Zealand are doing the things that you can do to stop animals going extinct. We choose not to do them because they are expensive, but we could do them. And he said, we've got $50 billion to buy submarines, but we've got, 20 species that are on the edge of extinction, and we don't do, we hand a few $1 million over for it, but it's not going to do that. And he said it's about the priorities, So, there is something, I do think sometimes that conditional language is useful as well, because what you don't want to do is take away we can actually stop emissions rising. We can stop temperatures rising if what we do is we cut emissions. We can stop that animal going extinct. Like, extinction is not something that has to happen. But yeah, I'll stop talking about it in a moment. But one of the things that's not in the article, which I thought was really extraordinary, was he was talking about. I said, so what do you do with them all? And they gathered there. I love this. This is such a scientist answer. They're in this one cupboard not because, they want to bring people like me there and make me feel sad. They're there because they're really valuable. So if there's a fire, they can grab them all at the same time. Just such a kind of curatorial and scientific kind of reason for them to all be in this one extraordinary place. But I said, so what do you do with them all? You've got all of these bits of animals. What's their scientific value? And he said, well, we've been doing genetic studies of them. And he said one of the arguments you hear about extinct animals is that you end up with isolated populations that become genetically unviable and they kind of die out because they're vulnerable. He said with lots and lots of these animals, what we see is that they are hugely diverse genetically, and then they are gone in 10 years because cats and foxes moved into that territory and just ate them. Yeah. They were just gone. And he said these animals, a number of them, when you look at them genetically, you can see that they didn't actually have time to become genetically restricted. They were just gone, which I thought was an extraordinary kind of thing to know. And he said you can just literally see there's places where the fat cats and the foxes arrive and they just disappear. In 10 years they're gone.
Unbelievable. I want to leave time for your questions. We're going to turn the lights on and we'll have a mic that will come to you. I think Carl's going to turn the lights on for us. There we go. Lovely. If you have a question for James, we would love to hear from you. And I know it's hard to go first. There we go. Thank you very much. We'll bring the microphone to you. I think we're going to start at the back and then we'll come to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Great discussion. And I just wanted to ask more about jellyfish. There's this kind of, I don't know if it's a myth or there's an idea out there that, jellyfish are going to overtake fish in the oceans because of how we're plundering the oceans and changing, the makeup and global heating and all of that. Do you address that in the book, or do you have anything to say on that?
I don't actually, but what I do know about the jellyfish thing is that so there's been quite a lot of stuff about jellyfish kind of taking over the ocean, as you say. There do seem to be rises and falls in the numbers of jellyfish. I know that what I do know is I've spoken to a couple of scientists who are very sceptical of the argument that jellyfish are increasing in ways that will take over the ocean. I think it's one of those things that's a good story. I'm not sure that it's as wound up with science as it possibly should be, but that's only from a couple of conversations I've had. But the thing that I did find out from one of them, which was really interesting, is that you get cycles in the numbers of jellyfish, and in the numbers, I think, of bluebottles. And one of these scientists was saying, who works on bluebottles, and I asked her, how did you end up working on bluebottles? And she said, well, it wasn't really my life stream. But she was fantastic, actually. But she's got a theory that bluebottle numbers fluctuate, and she thinks it's related to the solar cycle. So the wind changes, you get more wind as the sun kind of goes through that cycle, and you get more wind as a result of that, overturns more water, you get more nutrient moving around, so you get more bluebottles at certain points in the solar cycle. And she said she's never managed to prove it, but she's sure that that's the case. Which the research is not published, but this is a theory, but I liked that theory. But the jellyfish thing is really interesting because there's, in fact, and I think the woman who did that work is now down in Tasmania, although she's American. But I think there is disagreement within scientific circles about whether that is the case.
There's a question.
But I'm not a jellyfish scientist, so I can't tell you.
Yep, we'll just bring the mic to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about, I really enjoyed the section on beaches, the chapter on beaches, the shoreline and everything about that, and the energy. But at the end there's a quote from a Tahitian philosopher about taking the word island and making it into a verb called islanded, and about that as being how you look inwards and to contain everything within the island that's surrounded by the water. And I was wondering, how can we do that in Australia? Because we live on a big island.
Yeah, we do. Well, I mean, I think her idea is that, you become aware of the boundedness of resources and that sense. I mean, so it's a kind of spaceship Earth kind of notion, isn't it? It's interesting with Australia. I mean, I heard someone once call Australia a veranda culture, and they said we sit around white Australia sits around the edge, looking outwards anxiously, thinking who's going to come and take it away from us. But it was I'm not sure who said it. It was a wonderful term. But I mean, I do think that, I think what you see in Australia is we have, Europeans have been here for 240 years, and we have trashed the joint. It's just, quite aside from, Indigenous disposition, those things at a kind of ecological level, we've kind of trashed the place, and that. That is about, I think, a kind of really weird attitude to the thing, and also I think a lack of recognition often that it was a managed landscape. It was not just kind of a natural space when we arrived. There were people who lived here, and they were managing it in really sophisticated ways and quite precise ways as well. But I think that kind of beginning to think about it as a place that is kind of not limitless and not kind of ours for taking, if that makes sense. I think also beginning to think about the way it is connected to the ocean. I mean, I think one of the other things that you get with a lot of European cultures is this sense that ocean is this kind of blank space between places. And, first of all, it's not blank. But secondly, when you look at particularly kind of Indigenous cultures, they have sea country, they recognise how intertwined all of those things are and how much they're all part of the same kind of living space. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
I also think that the person the poet also said, I want people to walk on my ashes. She said, if the future generations walk on this beach, they will walk on my ashes, and they have to know that.
Yeah, and that kind of sense of our connection to the past. Because, I do think that kind of idea of thinking about where we came from forces you to think about where I'm going. And there's that kind of sense, I think, when I was stumbling around when I was talking about the learning stuff before, but there is something about learning to think more than about 10 minutes into the future, like thinking about what are we leaving here for people in 100 years, in 200 years, and I think that is something that we fail on a massive scale to do at the moment. So,
got time for a few more questions. Thank you for that one. At the back, thank you.
Hi, I'm a science teacher, and so I'm always looking for, I guess, things that can inspire my students to share with my students in terms of science. So I'm guessing you're quite widely read on this topic, and I'm just curious what you could share with us in terms of what you've read that would be interesting in terms of science writing recently.
What have I read in science? So I've been reading Ferris Jabar's new book, Becoming Earth. I don't know if you say it Jabar, Jabr. I've never heard it said. Which I think is extraordinary. It's literally about the Earth as a kind of living system and the idea of, the kind of, kind of life distributed right through the crust. And I thought it was a really, really kind of remarkable book and incredibly readable. And there are some excerpts from it online, which is probably helpful for kids. What else have I read recently that I thought was good? Of course, everything has left my brain. I am reading, there's a book by Olive Heffernan called The High Seas, which is about, it's about the kind of exploitation of the oceans, which I think is very good. It's excellent. I read a terrific book about sound in the ocean called Sing Like Fish a couple of months ago. And I've just read a fantastic book, in fact, by an Australian writer called Lauren Fugue called Voyagers, which is about, I don't know, it's actually quite... there's a number of resonances between it and deep water, actually. But it's very much about the way that kind of movement across the planet and that has kind of shaped us as a species. I thought it was really, really fantastic. And I, of course, cannot remember anything I've read now that you ask me that.
Fantastic. I want to invite George up here quickly to do one thing before we wrap up for the evening. George is the president of the Petersham Bowling Club, and we wanted just to invite him up here because today is the birthday of a very special person who is a very important part of the Petersham Bowling Club. So before we wrap, we just wanted to do something quick.
Thank you so much. We don't normally interrupt with birthdays.
Sorry.
It's
Yes.
like, it's true. It's not like we normally do this. Hi, I'm George. We're a community club. We've been here since 2006 when we took over this joint, when it's going to be failed and going to be demolished, etc. It's a long story. It's got a lot of people around who've been really working in the background really hard all the way, volunteering. And also as part of Readers, John Collier, who's on our audio desk, he does all this for free, right? He supports it really well. And he's been here since like 2005, fighting the good Petersham fight. And we don't often give a call out, but tonight we went, John, happy birthday.
Happy birthday, John.
Yeah.
Happy birthday, John.
Yeah. Thank you. We love you. And don't turn my mic off. Thanks very much.
Thanks, George. Just give back the card. Thanks.
Okay.
You can get back the card. I wanted to say, before I say a few words to close about James Bradley, that you saw the wonderful books up the back. James will be signing books up the back. You can buy copies, you can chat with him, you can ask him more questions. I'm doing a weird thing in reverse where I'm talking about other things before I keep talking about James. Next month, August the 22nd, we're joined by Shankari Chandran, who won the Miles Franklin last year, to talk about her book, Safe Haven, which is that, a thriller set in detention centres that's entertaining. Like, seriously. In September, we've got Elsa Piper talking about her memoir. In October, we've got Nick Bryant talking about the American election. You want to be here for that one as well. And also, if you've loved tonight as well, we're always looking to spread the word. Tell your book clubs, tell your friends who haven't come yet. The more people, the better. We really love to see this many wonderful faces at the Petersham Bolo. But I wanted to say there are so many brilliant sections of James's book, but there's a quote in the book, which is in James, where you say, thinking about all of these convulsions is extremely challenging. You say it demands new ways of imagining the interplay between human actions and planetary forces. It requires a recognition of the unimaginably complex web of connections that give shape to historical processes that have brought us to this juncture, and perhaps most importantly, it demands we find ways of making emotional and ethical sense of a world that has come unmoored from the certainties of the past. And I wanted to thank you, James Bradley, tonight for giving us a framework to make emotional and ethical sense of the world we live in now. Please join me in thanking James Bradley.
Thank you. Thank you very much.